Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Robin Wouters, and I'm a technology journalist specialized in Europe's innovation ecosystems. As the founder of TechEU, I'm delighted to work with a number of partners on EIC Scaling Club, which is a new initiative that aims to play a super active role in connecting Europe's leading deep tech scale-ups, investors, but also other stakeholders in order to grow the ecosystem to the benefit of everyone. With that context in mind, I'm quite delighted to be joined today for this podcast by the co-founder and CEO of a super interesting deep tech company that was born in the CEE region, in Bulgaria more specifically. Please welcome Svilen Rangelov. He's the co-founder and CEO of Dronamics, which is billed as the world's first cargo drone airline. A big warm welcome, Svilen. Can you tell us a little bit more about Dronamics and what you're building over there?
Thank you, Robin, and thanks for having me. Yes, Dronamics is a company that builds new type of aircraft that are specifically customized for cargo. They are unmanned, and we operate them as a service to customers like freight forwarders or Fortune 500 companies. The challenge that we solve is that by creating a smaller building block of air cargo, we can actually accelerate air cargo. We can do same-day delivery over very long distances happen. In practicality, we can cover all of Europe within 12 hours or less for €5 or less per kilo.
Fantastic. How did this come about? Like, when was it started, and what was the reasoning behind it? What was the idea?
Yeah, so we're not the first to try to make a drone. In fact, the inspiration came from when we saw the Amazon drones being unveiled. It's now 10 years ago. And we thought, okay, these are great last mile vehicles, but what about the step before that, the middle mile? What about connecting cities that are far away? Being brought up in Bulgaria, we were always cognizant that, yes, we're part of Europe, but we're far away from the main centers of the international commerce. So we had that chip on the shoulder, and we wanted to solve that by making the world a smaller place with aviation.
Fantastic. And you're now almost 10 years into the journey, but it's been quite a big year for you, 2023, because you had your first commercial flight test, I think, a couple of months ago. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we flew. We had our maiden flight earlier this year, and we also, a year ago, we also achieved our license. So we're the first one and remain the only ones to have such a large drone that's for cargo, that's licensed to operate under the new EU drone rules, and that's quite exciting. So we're very proud that Europe is actually taking the lead in this. So it's been a big year for us. We also just received our IATA codes and ICAO codes, so any airline has those, and it helps them integrate into the global aviation system. So customers can send their cargo on our airplanes just the same exact way in their systems that they would send it on a Lufthansa or other flight. Fantastic. So it's been a big year for us.
Yeah, it sounds like the beginning of the next chapter for you guys.
Yeah, it's an inflection point for sure.
Fantastic. Now, is there anything specific to Bulgaria that makes you very fit to build this kind of company in terms of the talent that you have there, or I don't know, aviation knowledge or specific engineering talent?
Yeah, so yes and no. Back in 1910, 1912, in that period, for 2 years, Bulgaria made a few world's first. So we had the first female military pilot, right, in the world. We constructed the first airport in the world. We had the first, successful landing with a failed engine. Before that, every time the pilot, dies in a crash and so on. So they don't live to tell the tale of what went wrong and so on. So, by being the first one who actually successfully landed after his engine failed mid-flight, this is a huge advance in aviation. So Bulgaria, and at the time, remember, there was no internet, right? Well, not remember, we weren't there, but imagine there was no internet. There was, so it was just a few years after the Wright brothers did the first flight at Kitty Hawk. And for this knowledge to compound and to propagate to the other side of the world, and for people to kind of accumulate on top of it, it's quite transformational. So Bulgaria, before, from then until the 1950s, had a, really thriving aerospace industry, we had 3 factories. They built 1,000 aircraft, 40 different models were developed, and so on. But once, after the Second World War, we were on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. The factories got shut down, and so on. So for 70 years, nobody in Bulgaria did that. And in fact, we were stuck in a place where, okay, all the aviation talent that's studying and so on, they either work in maintenance jobs at the local airport, or they just simply go abroad. So we went sort of against the mainstream by basing ourselves here, because we knew it would take a long time to develop the aircraft, and therefore we would really want to be in a place where we can do some prototyping in a very efficient and quick way.
Great.
But it was not intuitive. If you were to draw back like a Venn diagram of customers, talent pool, supply chain, and investors for aerospace company, Bulgaria barely touches any of these 4 circles. Thankfully, it's not like that anymore. We now have more than 100 people working here out of our Sofia office, doing all kinds of things from R&D, manufacturing, business side, and so on. So we kind of willed it into existence.
Yeah. And if you sort of look at the company now, almost 10 years in, or about 10 years in, how much of it is driven by the science and engineering behind it, and how much of it is sort of doing business and research and partnerships and whatnot? And of course that's going to shift now, but what's it been like the first 10 years?
Well, we have quite a few innovations, so it looks quite conventional to the untrained eye, fixed wing aircraft. But there's a whole lot of design decisions that we took, knowing that we're unburdened by the fact that there's no board, and we did not have that requirement. So we focused on the mission that it needs to be relevant for the most mass market vehicle possible in this class. So that what if a person in a village in a very remote area in a developing country can use, right, and still be connected to the main centers of commerce over long distances, where there's no infrastructure and so on. So we really need to make something very robust, very able to withstand a number of conditions and so on. So we're not building, a Rolls Royce or a Bentley. We're building actually like a Volkswagen Golf, if I may say.
Yeah, no shame in that. And this, what you're describing would be described now as a deep tech company. Now it's a relatively new term, and everyone sort of gives their own definition to it. Do you consider yourselves to be a deep tech company, and what does the term mean to you?
Yeah, well, I'm happy that this has sort of emerged, because when we started, the term didn't exist. In my mind, it's a company, as the name suggests, that there's a lot more underneath the surface. So you cannot just say we're the Uber of X, right? So a deep tech definition in my mind is something that doesn't fit well into a 30-second elevator pitch. It takes time for people to grasp the different complexities. In my mind, it tends to be more hardware, but because I'm biased, we exist in the atoms rather than bits space. And yeah, it's what it's like. It's like you have to learn that the iteration time and the feedback loop will be longer. So therefore, you have to be more selective about the types of experiments that you run during those iterations. Especially since the first 6 or 7 years we had done on a cumulative investment size of around 3 million euros, right? And they didn't come 3 million from day one. We started with 25K back in 2014. So we had to really, really be mindful that, we can't just use the typical aerospace things just because we couldn't afford them. So we had to kind of reinvent a lot of things along the way. We had to construct our own oven, right? Because we couldn't afford an oven. We had to construct our own everything, learn to be carpenters, welders, a lot of supporting stuff that we just didn't have access to. So you're building the whole ecosystem yourself, at least in our case.
Has that slowed you down, or do you think you needed those challenges to sort of get to the place that you are now?
Well, what gave us air cover was the lack of regulations. Because again, we were not the only ones who had that idea. We were not the first ones to have such an idea, but we're the only ones left standing, at least for the only ones who are that much in the game, right? And by being super constrained from a cash point meant that okay, it actually was a good fit for what we're trying to solve. In cargo, the customers don't want to pay. Like Jeff Bezos was teaching the world for 30 years that shipping should be free. It cannot be free. You're moving, you're spending energy to move atoms, right? But so then if it's not free, it should be as cheap as possible. Well, therefore, your system needs to be as as low cost as possible, both to construct and operate. In fact, that's why we called it the Black Swan, because even though it's white, we like the story of how Black Swan is something that everyone thinks that cannot exist, but it actually does, to remind us that we're not building just a new type of airplane that's unmanned. We're not sticking an autopilot on a Cessna. That has been done 10, 15 years ago. What we're doing is doing a new product that needs to be cheaper than the existing products. And that's extremely difficult to do with technology. So being so constrained in funding and yes, it took more time. But even if it took less time, we would not have been able to commercialize because the regulations didn't work. So we actually, just at the time when the regulations in Europe opened, we were kind of ready to converge on them. And honestly, they're confirmation of all the different decisions and bets we made, because we had no idea how these regulations could come about. But it seems like they align perfectly with our crawl, walk, run approach in design thing. Like, don't go after huge, new propulsion systems, new battery, hydrogen, supersonic, hypersonic things. Like, don't add too much new things. Start with something that's closer to reality, certification, and so on, and then upgrade. And these regulations, they reward that. And as a consequence, they are very driven by existing aviation rules, which means that because back then we didn't know, and we assumed it would be certified like a regular airplane, we designed for those requirements, and those are the same exact requirements that actually the rules demand. So we actually were able to foresee this. We're lucky that it played out this way, but also, we're happy that it did.
Yeah, it sounds like you made a couple of clever decisions given the time constraints, but also got the timing right, which of course is not always a given. So you mentioned cash and funding at some point in your answer. I wanted to talk a little bit about that. I think it was in November 22 when you announced that you've been awarded a grant, a 2.5 million euro grant by the European Commission under the EIC, or European Innovation Council Accelerator Program. Now, can you tell us a little bit more about how that came about? Did you already know the EIC? How did you become aware of the program in the first place? And how did you manage to secure the grant?
Yeah, so the way we understand the EIC was that it is the what previously used to be the Horizon 2020 program, which also had grants for deep tech projects that are from TRL 6 above, and could get funded up to 2.5 million euros. At the time, Horizon 2020 only focused on grants. Now there's blended finance, and we're actually also the recipients of the blended one. So we have also an equity commitment from the EIC towards our next round, which is quite important and quite great. But I think that application was number 5. If you count all the times we applied during Horizon 2020, I'm very happy at, again, how the EIC pivoted into this new framework, because the old one, I think, was skewed a lot more towards, it's just another funding program for lab research, where I'm sure there must be other paths through the university systems and so on to do that. But if you can name a unicorn or a company that we use in our daily lives that originated with the Horizon 2020 grant, I'll be surprised. I think the EIC took a lot more realistic approach. It's like, okay, we care about the technology, and we're not afraid of the complexity. So hence we'll go after deep tech, but we care about it being relevant for the market. And the whole process, the way they streamline it, I liked it a lot better too, because it's a lot more converging towards what you would go with a typical venture capitalist. So it's a lot more market based. And yeah, I think that kind of, because of our history of private funding and going through the motions of pitching and preparing materials, data rooms, and so on, we were actually quite well prepared also for that pivot of the EIC when it happened. And then the EIC were very happy that it recognized our traction. Of course, when we also applied back during the Horizon 2020 programs, we were at a much earlier stage. So I'm not saying that it was necessarily the structure of the program. It's definitely also a fit for us at the stage. Yeah, I think they did a lot of things right when they changed the model into the EIC. And the best thing, from my point of view, personal point of view, as a European taxpayer, I love the fact that now there's an equity component, because you very well know how companies, especially in deep tech, they require a lot of capital, and after a certain round size, you just have to go to the US. I'm happy that that's not the case anymore, and this is a huge step in that direction. And the EU taxpayer and future pensioners will get to benefit from the upside that all these future unicorns will develop.
Yeah, fantastic answer. I didn't know this was your 5th application, actually, so that's always good to know. And you're right, of course, the EIC was sort of born out of the old Horizon 2020, now Horizon Europe. Is sort of the umbrella for the EIC, but it's relatively early days for the program itself. So I'm guessing it also had to grapple with some growing pains. So what for you were some of the things that the EIC or the EIC Accelerator in particular can improve upon?
Well, we could always wish that it took less time, right, to decide. But again, I'm not sure. I haven't looked into the numbers. You know very well a venture fund, a single venture fund, how they have a pipeline of, let's say, single-digit thousands of inbound or deals that they review on an annual basis, and they get to end up making like 10, 20 investment decisions with a very small team. I think I'm sure there's thousands of applicants every stage, and I think it's if a venture fund can move fast, so can the AC. But at the same time, it's again order of magnitude faster than Horizon 2020 process was, in my view. So it's it's definitely been going in the right direction. So once they get the better hang of it, and I'm sure it will be faster, more streamlined, and future founders will only benefit from that flywheel.
Great. And aside from the money, the grant that you've received, but also the equity commitment, has the EIC played a role in, for example, connecting you to potential co-investors or other actors in the ecosystem that you feel were important in the journey?
Yeah, in fact, it's been quite hands-on. We just had a visit from one of their representatives, who happened to be in town. We also speak at a lot of events. We've had quite an engagement. We get introductions from for both investors, potential customers, and so on. So it's definitely a lot of value add. It's not just okay, here's a grant, call us if there's something. They're very proactive, and I really like that.
Great to hear. Now, aside from what the European Commission and the EIC is doing for stimulating deep tech entrepreneurship in Europe, what more can we do you think, from your vantage point, to sort of encourage people to think more long-term, to tackle more and bigger problems, and to, in general, be more ambitious in their endeavors?
Yeah, no, I think, so a couple of things. I think on one hand, I'm sure you noticed the narrative violation, how the EU was actually the first one to implement drone regulations from around the world. In fact, these drone regulations have been worked on by 63 countries since 2007, and the EU played a big part in them, and they were the first to implement. But there's 40 countries that also sat on those committees and haven't yet implemented it. They will, because they're very familiar, and also the EU's lead is quite important. The EASA is one of the best, if not the best regulator in that. So I really don't like when typically in media, people have that impression that the EU is slow, bureaucratic, and so on, because I have the evidence, the receipts to show that it actually is a leader, and regulation can actually be an enabler for business. But where I think there could be things to improve are Bulgaria's ecosystem kind of started, and we're the beneficiaries of that when the EIF did a wild bet back then. So back then, in I think 2010, 2012, it had a program where typically they would, where they would guarantee bank loans to SME. So I think there was some folks in the government of Bulgaria that persuaded the EIF that let's carve out 20% of that package and give it to two, privately managed, like professionally managed accelerators. So it's 100% EIF money. But those two accelerators, 11 and Launchpad, which I know you know very well, they essentially ended up investing in 200 plus companies in the local market that kickstarted the whole ecosystem. So while this wasn't the typical approach of the EU and the institutions back then, they saw an opportunity to test something, and it turned into, right now we have more than a dozen funds just in Bulgaria, like a very, 6 million people country, right, in the EU. So I think the EU should just keep doing kind of like bets out of the ordinary like that. One obvious low-hanging fruit to me would be, okay, a huge source of venture funding in the US has been, the pension funds. I think there should be more like encouragement because for pension funds to also participate in VC, so there's more capital available and so on. So again, when you need to go raise 50 million, you don't have to talk to only overseas VCs. You get to keep that technology here in Europe and so on. So I think there's a lot that could be done there with relatively low effort. And ultimately, I'm not sure how we feel about it, but I feel like my generation, the retirement age will be like 80 or 85, right? The math has kind of long stopped working. So I do think it's kind of like a must that the sooner these funds get access to higher yield investment opportunities, the better, right? And so, I think that could be a easy bet to place and test the waters and then roll it out bigger. But that's just, again, my personal view. Not, I'm sure there's a lot of folks thinking along those lines as well.
Yeah, but I think a lot of people would agree with you. Let's just hope that it's not going to take a generation or maybe even 2 generations before we get to that point here in Europe. Okay, but that's maybe a topic for another day. Just to go back to the deep tech prowess that we have here in Europe, because there's this notion, which is rooted in reality, is that Europe has a lot of talent, scientific talent, academic talent, research talent. We prove it. We have the sheer numbers of people that are involved in this research and innovation field. It's there. But there's still this notion that it's very difficult to get that talent and research to come to the commercial market and actually make it to the market in the form of a startup or a scale-up or a unicorn eventually. What do you think can we do to improve that and to close that gap?
Well,
aside from more capital, which you've already touched on.
More capital. Yeah, exactly. So other than that, I think a little more time and more success stories, right? And you see this. So okay, in Bulgaria, if you're a young person who's motivated to work hard, you have just a handful of choices of where to apply yourself. You could either work for like a big multinational, but those big multinationals are typically, not the heart of the HQ is not in Eastern Europe, typically, right? It's somewhere out there. So you could be the local GM or whatever, which is great, and so on. But there's only so many of these. And then there's a lot of other, like it's very fragmented economy, right? So I think that's part of why the startup ecosystem has thrived with so little capital and so little encouragement. It's had an outsized impact here, just because it's not necessarily great for job security to have a regular job, if you know what I mean. There's not that many, wonderful job opportunities to begin with. Whereas I can definitely see how, if you're in Germany or France or somewhere else, you have a whole long list of, companies where you get to spend 20 years working for them and so on and get the gold watch and all that. And that's viable and that's a great path. But people aren't necessarily encouraged to realize that, okay, you only have one life, and then don't you want to get like maximum value? And yes, there's more to work than just money or an outsized return, but there's a lot of more impactful things to be done. So I think once the flywheel starts going and people see, I started with my peer group and I'm still in a corporate job, but this person I know actually went, did a startup, cashed out big on some stock options, and now has much better cars, or is farther ahead than I am, even though I did everything right, everything that I was told, by the old system that I should do right. Then people will start connecting the dots and, being a little more risk on. But I think, the appetite for risk in Europe, definitely not where it should be, given all the confidence, right? Because a risk is only frightening if you're not confident in what you're doing. If you're confident, then you can get a better assessment of what that risk career-wise is for you. And so Europe, having the world's largest number of PhDs and terminal degrees and so on, and yet only 2% of unicorn participation and so on, that's a huge disconnect in how risk is perceived, or how and so on. And I think it will just take a little more time, a few more years of great exits, great times. So great outcomes, not just for founders, but also for key employees with the stock option pools and so on.
Yeah, and their investors, of course. Yeah, I agree with you. Success breeds success. So the more success stories we have in Europe, the more we will have in addition. I agree with that. But on that note, who is your role model, and what's your favorite deep tech company in Europe, for that matter?
Well, my role models are folks actually like the founder of Zara, the founder of IKEA, the founder of Walmart. I like, obviously Henry Ford and so on. Folks who have found technological way to create a huge competitive advantage, either by, changing the way things are done on the supply chain or logistics side. And by doing that, they actually give a much wider amount of people the ability to lift their quality of life, right? So those are the folks that I really admire and look up to. I think it's much less work to create something super shiny, super nichey, the most expensive car, the most expensive watch, the most expensive, price is what? A function of demand. But figure out how to make it, the best one at a very low price point. That's really, really difficult. Yeah. But not only is that difficult, but also is the most rewarding, because everyone gets to wear a watch, everyone gets to have a car, everyone gets to have access to all these things that can meaningfully change your life and the life of your children and so on. So I don't know, that's the chip on the shoulder we get from being raised in the post-communist Bulgaria, where, there were empty shelves and hyperinflation and so on. Like we all went through that, like millions of people. But that's kind of like always been the more interesting part to me. Not the niche luxury thing, but the mass market thing that changes the world.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Like democratizing access to technology in a meaningful and a in a scaled way, right? But what about European deep tech? Is there any company aside from Dronamics that you really look up to and admire for the things that they're doing?
Well, I really like ISAR for what they're doing, right? It is rocket science what they are really doing. I like, OneWeb. I like the fact that there are those really ambitious people who are not really giving up and saying, we're too late. We're too late to send rockets into space. We're too late to have a constellation of satellites to enable super low-cost broadband and so on. That people still there are pockets of people that still have this outsized level of ambition. And so really happy to see that. I'm sure there's more, but those are the first two that come to mind.
Fantastic. We're going to wrap up the conversation, but I had one question left about sort of this narrative that you talked about earlier for European tech. When you go to the US to talk to, either investors or potential partners, customers, what do you think their view on Europe is when it comes to their, the ability to innovate here?
Well, the unfiltered view for most is Europe is for vacation. And it's just, I studied in the US. I like the US a lot. I have many friends there. And so I can see how a lot of folks can be fully happy with just owning the American market, because it in itself, in so many industry, it is, for all intents and purposes, the global market for certain things. I do wish more of them would be happy to go on airplanes, do more board meetings outside and so on, get the hang of the ecosystem, learn all these things that we're seeing firsthand on the ground, because it is becoming more and more multipolar world. And while, they were the only game in town 10, 20 years ago, it's no longer the case. Capitals become more and more commodity, even despite the downturn and so on. There's so much sitting on the sidelines waiting to be deployed, and not just in Europe. Like if you start going east, Middle East, Asia, and so on, there's billions and billions of people that have yet to enjoy the fruits of this huge technological development, and there's going to be a lot of capital that funds this future growth, and it's not necessarily going to come from a single country, and they need to accept that. So I don't believe in winners take all, at least in the physical space. So it will be quite competitive, and they need to know that a lot of great things are happening in Europe as well.
Much agreed, and thank you so much for sharing that insight. It's a perfect ending note. Svilen, thank you so much for your time again, and all the best with Dronamics.
Thank you, Robin. It's a pleasure.